Welcome to ABA Generalized, the podcast where we will bring a positive view to the world of applied behavior analysis.
We are your hosts, Erica, G, and Ann, here to share inspiring stories, practical tips, and share some of the latest research to help you thrive in your ABA practice.
Whether you're a seasoned professional, a student, or just curious about ABA, our goal is to spread positivity, foster a supportive community, and empower you to make a meaningful difference.
Every Monday, we'll dive into topics ranging from success stories to self-care strategies and professional growth.
Plus, we'll be featuring interviews with leading experts and real-life heroes in the field who are making an impact with their positive approach.
Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at ABA Generalized the pod and send us your thoughts, questions, or success stories to aba.generalized.podcast@gmail.com. Also, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.
So grab your headphones, get comfortable, and join us for today's episode of ABA Generalized.
Welcome back. Maybe I should just proactively say, if you hear voices in the background, you're not imagining it. It's my kids.
You're not hearing extra voices.
Or sound effects. I don't know. So I'm going to probably mute a lot while I'm not talking. But today, in today's episode of ABA Generalized, we're going to be talking about continuous versus discontinuous measurement. I will be right back so I can remove this dinging toy. No, he still has it, so we'll see.
Great.
Okay, so discontinuous versus continuous measurement. Erica, if you can describe, you want to describe that?
Sure. So continuous versus discontinuous measurement. So those are pretty big words, right? So like your continuous measurement is going to be anything that you can literally continually take, right? So you're continually taking your frequency, your rate, your duration, your latency, did I ever say latency? No, IRT, your inter-response time, right? That's what IRT stands for. Yeah, inter-response time. While your discontinuous measurement is going to be more of your interval type data collection. So these are all about how we are taking behavior data, and sometimes it's how we're taking some of our skill acquisition data. So it all depends on what your program is. So sometimes we are taking frequency on a skill acquisition. And I think that might be the only real time, sometimes duration too. So if we're trying to track how long a client or a kiddo is playing with something or engaged in something, we'll use duration. And then, going back to what discontinuous measurement is, that's your interval training or your interval trials, I should say. So your partial interval, your whole interval, and your momentary time sampling. So let's break it down a little bit more. So Anne, do you want to start with talking about a little bit more about what frequency, rate, duration, or even your IRT or latency are?
Yeah, so let's start with frequency and rate. Those are the most common ones, I think, that we see with skill acquisition and with like behavior reduction goals. So just to be clear, and I think this was drilled into our heads, frequency and rate are not the same thing. Rate is more accurate because you can do rate per hour, rate per day, rate per minute, like, however the goal is written. Where frequency, you're just, you're both tallying. You're tallying for both, but frequency, it's just total. It's not per anything. So you can't get, I'm so sorry. This is the non-ABA side of me. So frequency is just, total count. Rate is divided by time, essentially.
Yeah. So it's your frequency.
Frequency. There you go. Perfect. Duration is the time from start to stop, how long something is. You can do minutes, hours. It really depends on like the length of the session. And going back to rate, if you have clients who have sessions that differ in length, that's where you would want to use rate over frequency, because then you're comparing sessions that are different in length, and you're going to get a more accurate number of how often those behaviors are engaging.
Yeah.
Or I don't know what I'm saying anymore.
I mean, no, but you're right. Like, you're going to get a more accurate number. And that's why, like, the company we worked for in Pennsylvania together, they used rate all the time. And so when I moved here, the company I worked for, they did not have that set up on their data collection system. So it was just frequency or percentage or duration. Like, they didn't have all of the options available for on their data collection system. So it was a culture shock for me, because we literally use rate for everything unless you're using like your partial or your whole.
Same. I had a similar experience, and even in schools, like we talk about frequency a lot, like for data collection. I'm like, but it's not really frequency, but okay.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like I use duration a lot of time. Like, duration is literally just length of time, like you said. And I feel like latency and IRT I don't use, but they fall under that continuous measurement. Can you talk more about what those mean, Anne?
Yeah. So latency is how long it takes for your client to start until like they start something. So you don't really see this in like the behavior reduction goals. You might see this more in a skill acquisition goal. So if you have a goal that's like so-and-so will transition to the carpet in under 2 minutes. So your timing, so like when the SD is, okay, it's time to go to carpet, how long from the SD to when they get to the carpet? So if the goal is 2 minutes, then they're likely taking like longer than 2 minutes to get to the carpet. So the goal would probably be for that one is to shorten that IRT or the latency, sorry. Inner response time is, let me think about this one. It's the time between behaviors. So it's the time.
Let me see her bucket.
Whose bucket?
Dora.
No.
The popcorn.
Her pop. Yeah, there's candy in it. We are recording this the day after Halloween, friends.
Okay, so you're right. Okay.
So it's the end of one behavior or one skill acquisition goal and the beginning of the next. Does that make sense? So like that chunk in between.
Yeah, so it's literally the time between target responses by the student. So, and you're usually apparently, this is good to know. I am using my behavior speak book.
What's that?
Oh, really? You don't know what this is? So I was actually told when I was studying to get this book because it helps break down a lot of the terminology. Yeah. So I love this book because it helps me if I have like parents that are just really struggling with understanding some of the language, because obviously we want to talk in layman's terms and stuff. I will bring this with me and I'll talk to parents like, okay, so this is what this means. And let's break it down a little bit further, like, and it has examples and stuff, which is cool. So it's basically just like a definition book. That's all it really is. But so what's really interesting about IRT, it also is often an object of analysis. What? Okay, so it says often an object of analysis of differential reinforcement of low rates and differential reinforcement of high rates. So you want to either lower the rate of the behavior or increase the rate of the behavior, it seems. So
I can see that. So like if you want to increase like the time between
the responses
behaviors, that makes sense.
So we were talking about IRT and latency. I think we hit everything with that. Okay, so like IRT, you're going to most likely be either increasing or decreasing the amount of the behavior that we want to see. So like if you want to see them, shorter response time or a longer response time. Now, when we talk about discontinuous measurement, there's partial interval, there's whole interval, and there's momentary time sampling. I don't know about you, Anne, but I use partial interval a lot because you want to use it to decrease a behavior, but you're having high rates of it. So way to think about it, especially while we were studying, I remember this very clearly. It was like POD. So partial interval is going to be on the top and it has an arrow. So like the P has an arrow going down. So meaning that like it's high rates of behaviors, but you want to decrease it. Whereas the PUD, or sorry,
Pod puff, I thought it was.
Was it puff?
Partial.
I don't have my notebook anymore because my text has it.
Pod puff overestimates and
partial interval. Nope, never mind. Well, I do. Okay, so like scratch that. Okay, so anyways, so back to partial. I don't remember what I just said, but I'm gonna just pretend we didn't say any of it. So when it comes to discontinuous measurement, partial and whole interval are kind of like easy to navigate because if you put partial on top and then have the arrow going down from the P, it means that you're trying to decrease the behavior, but you're more likely to have higher not higher rates, but you also will see a higher frequency of it. Oh, that's what it was. Pod puff. So frequency, you have a higher frequency of it because it overestimates, whereas the whole interval underestimates. But I don't remember what pod stands for.
I forget. It was like overestimate. So like you use partial interval because if you took frequency data on a behavior that's happening too much, you're gonna mess up. It's going to be too hard unless you have like a clicker and all you're doing is clicking, or like you had more staff. So like one could take the rate of it and click, 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 click while someone else is trying to decrease it and trying to de-escalate the client. But if that's not ever really the case, so partial interval, you would the BCBA would figure out like what, like, are you going to use 5-minute intervals, 10, 15, 30, an hour interval? Usually you want to start out smaller. And then as you're seeing the behavior decrease and less intervals being checked off, you're going to make the intervals longer. So yep, go eat it. So like I use like 15 or 30-minute intervals a lot in schools with behaviors that are usually happening all throughout the day. And it's just, there's not staff to continuously track the rate of them. So if they're like, okay, this happened at recess, like I saw this, and this happened at recess, and then I can just check off like, oh, what time was recess? Like, between 10 and 10:20, then check it off.
But it has to happen once within that interval.
Yep.
So like
once in that, if you see it at all in the interval, you're checking it off for the whole, so that's for partial interval. For whole interval, you want to see, like, that's kind of paired with duration. The behavior has to happen during the entire interval for it to count.
And usually you're looking at something that you want to increase. So the W goes underneath, like, so if you're looking at partial and whole, right? So the P goes down, right? The P has the arrow going down, whereas the W has it going up. So you're trying to increase the behavior, but it also underestimates sometimes. So,
Right.
Because you're not seeing the whole frequency of the behavior, you have to have it for literally that entire duration. So you don't know how many times it's happening necessarily because you're not taking frequency, but it does underestimate the behavior because it it has to be for that whole duration. I'm really confused. This book has partial intervals, but not whole.
Not whole. I actually don't think I've ever used full interval recording.
I have for increasing. It wasn't like a lot, like it was only for instruction. I will also say A lot of the behavior reduction strategies that I utilize is only if it's impeding on the child's learning. If the child is able to work through work and, focus on things, even with the behaviors occurring, if they're not severe, right? So like in severity, we mean like attacking others, attacking themselves, hurting, harm to themselves or others in general, destruction, property destruction, or elopement, right? So if they're able to not engage in those behaviors when they're, engaged in work related tasks, there's no need to really take data on that, because then you're really like messing with your intervals and stuff. So what I've always recommended to my techs is like, if it's occurring during an instructional time, take that data. But if it is not occurring during that instructional time, don't worry about it that much. Like they're allowed, unless it's hurting themselves or others, or like, they're putting themselves at risk. I will also say that when it comes to stimming, right? Like we've talked about this before, like any sort of self-stimulation, automatic behaviors, also being very mindful of the fact of like, if they're doing it because they're on a break, let them freaking do it. Like you do not have to take data on that. Like there is no need at all. It just kind of messes with your data, it skews it. So I really focus heavily on instructional time, especially for those behaviors, especially when I see the self-stimming.
Agreed.
But I do like, I will say like I have used whole interval for like keeping kids on task. So like I'll use it more. I will say that I don't use it as like a actual paper data or anything. I'll use it more as like token economy will be my whole interval. So if you're sitting for 5 minutes and we're trying to increase that time, so it's technically like a DRH in a sense, right? Like differential reinforcement of high rates of behavior, where you're trying to increase a child sitting, but you need some sort of like timer for yourself or timer for them to kind of like see it visually. I use a token economy. Okay, you sat for 1 minute, great, you get a star. 2nd minute, so on and so forth. And you can.
So when you explain it that way, then yes, I have done it that way. I guess I've just never done it with like a behavior reduction.
But I think also like, yeah, exactly. Like I feel like behavior reduction, because you're trying to increase something with the whole interval. It's not necessarily a behavior reduction strategy. Like unless you're trying to increase a child's or a person's usage of a coping strategy or a replacement behavior, right? Like then yes, like absolutely, like that makes sense. Like maybe like every day at lunchtime, they engage in SIB. Well, okay, we want to, that entire lunch period, we're gonna take whole interval recording, right? Like that's kind of silly just for one period, but like every day at lunchtime, we're taking whole interval recording to see, are they engaging in replacement behavior or are they engaging in that SIB, right? So kind of related to the behavior reductions, but I will say it's probably more of that like skill acquisition. And then momentary time sampling. We use this a lot in settings where there's large groups. So schools should be probably the best place to use it, or like if you're doing like group settings. So when we did social skills, I think we had done it maybe once or twice just as practice, but like I will say like you're usually giving the person a interval and they have to look up and see if the behavior is occurring at that end of that interval. That's basically it, momentary time sampling. And it's easier because then you can just literally see the timer go off, check something.
Yeah, and this one, yeah, maybe we have used it in social skills. I can't remember. I don't remember using this one.
I think I might have used it once or twice, honestly, just as like practice to like make sure that I understood it. And it might have been just even like probing data. So yeah, that's just the rundown of what continuous versus discontinuous measurements mean. We kind of went into like when we use it. Is there any other times that you can think of that you specifically use any of these recording strategies?
I will say going back to, I guess going back to partial interval, maybe there's a behavior like partial interval recording can be helpful to see if there's a pattern in like when the behavior is occurring during the day. You have your what?
I was gonna say the better thing to use for that would be a scatter plot.
Yep. Yeah. So then you can be like, oh wow, like this is constantly happening at 9 a.m. What's happening during that time? Like if it's in school, like is it during like a specific instructional time or a specific class period? I'm kind of doing this not necessarily partial interval reporting, but just so like in middle schools, students are going to have different class periods. So I have teachers all taking data just to see is a student struggling more in one class or like with one teacher, just to see like if there's a pattern. So that can be helpful as long as like the teachers are consistently taking them every day, not skipping days, like that can be hard too.
I think back to when we actually consulted with that school district back in Pennsylvania. I made scatter plots for them. And you think of scatter plots as like math, right? Like I'm going to put these points on the graph. No, it's not 8th grade math. I'm sorry. This is a table that is usually created with like time periods and then like a behavior maybe that you're specifically looking at or multiple behaviors that you're looking at. So usually you have like the definitions up top. You can also use this for potty training, by the way. I've done it for potty training. Where you literally create like a schedule and you're seeing, okay, did they have an accident? Did they successfully void? And all that stuff. And it's easier for parents to kind of see what time of day this is occurring so that this way you can easily just, looks like they are going consistently at this time of the day and, whatever, I'm going to bring them to the bathroom. But anyways, going back to like using it for behavior reduction, trying to figure out, okay, are they stressed out when we're doing this at this time? What time of day are they really just having this behavior? It just seems like it's happening every single day at this time. We don't understand why. It gives the clearer picture. But yes, I've used it in schools. I'm going to be cutting that whole part out. Anyways, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, we reviewed when do we use it, what do they mean, how do we collect it, how do we teach it? I think just being yeah, it's okay. I think just being really clear with whoever is going to be collecting the data. I like to write what I think is very clear, concise directions on for the tech, and we'll review it with them, like, hey, like for partial interval, you're just checking off if it happens. You don't have to tally. It's, or even like for duration. So I've seen multiple ways to do duration. You can either start a timer if you have one available to you, or you just write down the time that the behavior starts and then write down the time that it stops. And then at the end of the day, you can calculate how long, like the total duration for the entire day. Or if you're just, it's okay. Or if there's just like one specific period during the whole day that you need to take duration on. Just being really specific with and modeling how to take the data, like what's not necessary to include too.
And even like sample sheets. So like I've done sample data collection where like I will literally write sample at the top of it. And I'm like, don't put anything on this, but this is how I would take it. And this is how I want you to take it. And now let's practice. Okay, you saw this behavior. Do you mark it? What are you thinking? Like, or like I'll do some IOA data. So I will take the data also myself. So IOA stands for Inter-Observer Agreement. So, a lot of times BCBAs will observe the same exact behavior, either covert or overt. So whether you are being seen by the client or hidden. And excuse me. So anyways, yeah. So like covert or overt, to really get a bigger picture of what's going on and what the behavior looks like. And especially when you're teaching it in the beginning to your techs of like how to take that data, it's really important to take that IOA if you can. A lot of times it's very, a lot of times in ABA, we're shuffling around cases. We're, sometimes brand new to a case that's been going on for quite some time. So you're trying to also even learn what the behavior looks like. So IOA isn't always easy to just jump right into take because you're still trying to learn the client and stuff like that.
IOA data. So yeah, so I think it's important about IOA data to say that it's not to be used to tell the tech like, hey, you're doing something wrong. It's like, hey, I got this number, you got this number. And if they're different, why are they different? What did one of us count that the other one didn't? Like, you're looking at a behavior differently than I am. How can we, it's more based on the definition of the behavior if you're going to use it during a behavior reduction goal, just to see how can we clean up this definition to make sure that anyone who's looking at this will take the data the same way.
Right.
So,
exactly.
And then you have to decide okay, which one is the right way to do it and how do you come to an agreement? And it's usually you have to get 80% similar or, something you would have to predetermine that.
And I also think in order to use any of these, you need to make sure that you have a very solid definition for your operational definition, because otherwise, if Susie is, writing on her desk versus the piece of paper, and the definition says that Susie, has to decrease her writing on the table, but then you see her writing on the wall, right? And then you're it's not part of your definition. Writing on the wall is not part of your definition. It's writing on the table only. So if you're tech or you are taking data on behaviors that are, similar, but not in the definition, it skews your data, right? So then you see more of something and you're like, why am I seeing more of this? It's an increase. Oh, well, Susie was drawing on the wall. Well, that's not part of the definition, friend. So that's when we have to adjust and make sure that, it's something that is happening at high frequency. Maybe they've pivoted and they are just let me go from writing on the table to the wall. So there's that.
And I like that. And a lot of the times, I don't know if you see this a lot, but if a kid has throwing behavior, and so if that's in a definition, you want to make sure that you're not you can write this does not include throwing
examples
the ball because right, examples and non-examples so because you're gonna have someone that's gonna be oh, throwing they're throwing this ball, I'm going to count it. It's no, that's an appropriate thing to throw unless you're inside or unless it's directed to a TV. So you have to really be specific, and if you feel like you're being too specific, you probably aren't.
Exactly. And I think that it's important to note that behaviors are always changing. And I think we had talked about this before. So functions always change, the definitions of the behaviors change, because sometimes, behaviors go on extinction or the child or person doesn't feel like they're getting reinforced. Well, that's extinction, I guess, wasn't getting reinforced enough for the behavior. So they're going to change it and do something different and get that reinforcement, right? So you'll see a lot of curveballs being thrown by our clients or our kiddos. And it's very much you have to pivot and you have to be flexible, and you have to also make sure you're getting that ABC data. So if you don't know what ABC data is, go back to season 1 and listen to that.
So that concludes our episode on continuous versus discontinuous measurement. Very big, wordy words. Big, wordy words.
Which have a lot of umbrella. So it's the umbrella terms, right? So we have these two umbrellas and just raindrops coming out of them. No.
And I think what I remember, do you remember when we were studying this and it was so confusing, and the table that we were using was so confusing because it was a square with 4 squares in it, and it said discontinuous, continuous, and it was very at first just very, very confusing, but then when you understood how to read the chart, it was like, oh, that makes a whole lot of sense, because continuous, like the words just, they don't seem like they line up with the measurements that they do.
But like, if you think about it, you're continually taking data on your frequency, your rate, your duration, your IRT, and your latency. Whereas like your discontinuous, like it's going to mean intervals, right? Like you're literally having intervals. So I would think about it as that way. It's like it's stopping. Like there's always a stopping point. Discontinuous, you're stopping.
Yeah.
Anywho's.
Thank you for listening.
That's what I was about to say.
Well, you can say it too.
Thanks for listening, people. Sorry for the hot mess of an episode.
That's what happens when G's not here. G, we miss you.
All right. Anyways, well, before we get fired from our jobs, thanks for listening, and catch you on the flip.
ABA Generalized, the podcast, is not providing professional advice. Please seek a professional in your area for specific advice and support.